After breaking down 11 campaigns over the course of a few months, we have reached the final campaign in the series. Blood Harvest is another one of Left 4 Dead's most underrated campaigns. The forest setting is a great switch up from the typical ruined city, and on the lore side, there is a lot to talk about. Blood Harvest does have some interesting dialogue and wall graffiti, but this campaign also has a lot of ties to the Sacrifice comic. We'll talk about it near the end of the video, but for now, let's break down the story behind Blood Harvest. After the events of Dead Air, the survivors are seen camping out in the middle of a forest. On the right, you can find a sign displaying the Allegheny National Forest, and below it you can find yet another CEDA evacuation notice. This time, the location is Daughtery Farm. A few things to take note of before we get started. 1. If you look at the campfire, you can see the survivors using dollar bills to keep the fire going. Goes to show how worthless modern currency is in the zombie apocalypse. And secondly, while the exact locations of the campaigns are relatively unknown, we know that Blood Harvest takes place somewhere in the Allegheny National Forest. Not only that, if we're taking the cut campaign Dammit into consideration, Blood Harvest takes place somewhere close to the Kinzua Dam, which is the location of the Dammit campaign. And for those who may not know, the Kinzua Dam is a real dam in Pennsylvania. It's also located in the middle of the Allegheny National Forest. Keep in mind that Dammit was a cut campaign, so take this with a grain of salt. I'll go into more detail in a future video, but for now, let's keep talking about Blood Harvest. After crossing over a bridge, the survivors see a trailer, and sometimes the survivors will have this back and forth.
Francis, this look like home to you?
Yeah, I bet your country ass does like this trailer.
Shortly after, the survivors come across a building, and if you look down, you can see train tracks. If you go into NoClip and look on the side of the building, you can see the name Richardson Atlantic Freight Haulage. With that out of the way, let's break down the wall graffiti found in the beginning of Chapter 2. Head north to Echo. We deserve this. Maybe you did, I didn't do anything. Head north, get to Echo for evac to safe zone. Do not go. Army swarmed, farm is quarantined. Newburgh is doing helicopter evacs to safe zone. The army is dug up north. They're still taking immunes. It's the only evac for miles. Follow the train tracks. Chapter 2 is a very short chapter with one event involving an alarm door, and it's an easy event assuming you don't get the tank spawn. Chapter 3 has one piece of wall graffiti, and it's this, a whiteboard saying Echo. It should also be noted that just like with Crash Course, Blood Harvest has a lot of dead soldiers laying around, especially in Chapter 5, but we'll get to that in due time. For now, let's move on. At the end of Chapter 3, we have yet another event where the survivors have to break down a bridge by using a train. The safe room isn't that far, so it's an easy event, but in Versus, however, it's very easy to set up an ambush for devastating damage. We have a lot of ground to cover in Chapters 4 and 5. Let's start with some wall graffiti. In Chapter 4, there's only two pieces of wall graffiti, and it's this. Keep north, follow the train tracks to Echo. You can also find another CEDA evacuation notice telling any survivors to head for the Metro International Airport. The words, "This is quarantine," is seen written on the bottom of the paper. The first thing of note in Chapter 4 are the piles of dead livestock. If you go back to the Swamp Fever campaign, Rochelle hints at the possibility of the green flu virus spreading through animals. And while we don't know the answer to this question, it's clear that the survivors were not taking any chances. These animals could have been killed by zombies or killed by humans out of fear of the infection spreading. And considering the bodies are piled on top of each other, the latter seems to be the most likely outcome. Near the end of Chapter 4, the survivors cut through a house. In the basement of this house, you find a massive pool of blood and a lawnmower. According to the wiki, this is a reference to the New Zealand film Braindead, which has a scene involving a lawnmower that is, well, quite graphic. It should also be noted that the popular Stephen King book Misery also features a very graphic scene involving a lawnmower, so it could be a reference to that instead. Regardless, it's one of the strangest things in this campaign. If you go to the first floor of the same house, you can find a departure schedule that looks like it belongs at an airport or a train station, and according to the wiki, this is the same departure schedule seen in the train station level in Half-Life 2. And finally, if you look on the side of the building, you can see the name Ramsey. I was able to find a Ramsey station, but it's all the way in New Jersey instead of Pennsylvania. Now with all that out of the way, let's move on to the wall graffiti found in Chapter 5. Farm is quarantined, go to Riverside. Boats are leaving and zombies can't swim. David, we think the farm is overrun. Everyone we meet keeps saying it's gone. We're heading north anyway, what else can we do? Fingers crossed, see you there. Barbara. Howard, push north. When you get there, head for Echo Farm. Army is evacing now. They can't hold out forever. Hurry. Shortly after leaving the safe room, the survivors find multiple signs placed by the military, and after a short walk through a cornfield, the survivors officially arrive at Daughtery Farm. A few things to take note of before we talk about the finale. You can find a sign near the front of the house that says the following: U.S. Military Evacuation Outpost Echo, Passage to Northeastern Safety Zone. In the Crash Course campaign, a map can be seen showing the locations of various safety zones, and on the top right, you can find a green circle labeled the Northeastern Safety Zone. In my Crash Course video, I thought this green circle was Fort Millhaven, but judging by this sign, the Northeastern Safety Zone was referring to Outpost Echo. I'll go into more detail on Fort Millhaven and Fort Echo in just a second, but we have a few more things to break down. When you walk inside the house, you find 2 dead soldiers and a radio. Behind the radio, you find a map, similar to the ones I pointed out in the Death Toll video. If you take a closer look, you can find various regions with an X over them and the words Overrun is written all over the map. This is where things get tricky. On the top of the map, you can find the words Echo circled in red, with 2 arrows pointing towards a safety zone north of the map. This raises a few questions. On this map, the farmhouse and Fort Millhaven are not labeled or seen anywhere. However, we can safely assume that the farmhouse is located somewhere on the upper part of this map, and we know this for a few reasons. Let's head over to the Sacrifice comic for more info. In the Sacrifice comic, we get a look at Fort Millhaven and the soldiers who are stationed there. The survivors then use a radio to contact the military, and then Lieutenant Mora then says the following: "Tell Echo Base we'll take the run." Based on this line from the comic, it's safe to assume that Echo Base is a reasonable distance from the farmhouse. Echo is clearly capable of pulling off this rescue mission if it was up for consideration, but Lieutenant Mora ends up taking the mission instead. It's also important to note that after calling for help over the radio, it takes about 10 to 15 minutes for the military to arrive at the farmhouse, once again implying that the farmhouse is not far from Echo Base or Fort Millhaven. Not only that, we can safely assume that Fort Millhaven and Fort Echo are very close to each other as well. While driving to Fort Millhaven, a soldier is seen talking to someone over the radio, and their conversation goes exactly like this. "Rock, this is Rescue 9. We've recovered 4 Tango mics. Please advise. Rescue 9, bypass Echo and return to Millhaven." This line from the comic implies that the survivors actually drove past Echo Base on their way to Fort Millhaven. Now with that out of the way, let's go back to this map and try and pinpoint a location. Based on the evidence presented, I think the farmhouse takes place somewhere on the top right region of this map. Fort Millhaven, on the other hand, must be somewhere north of Echo Base. Remember, they had to drive past Echo Base to get to Millhaven. But keep in mind that most of this is just speculation. It's almost impossible to pinpoint an exact location. Now with that out of the way, let's go back to this map one more time. Similar to the maps found in Death Toll, if you look close enough you can see regions labeled on the map, but they are very hard to read. I'm pretty sure this name on the top right says Candy Mountain, and this is Red Ridge River. Important to note that I couldn't find any of these locations in the Allegheny National Forest. There is a real-life tourist attraction called Big Rock Candy Mountain Resort, but it's in Utah instead of Pennsylvania. I was able to find a Red Ridge Lake in Pennsylvania, but it's nowhere near the Allegheny National Forest. Now, before we talk about this finale from a gameplay perspective, we have a few more things to break down. First of all, this farmhouse looks very similar to the farmhouse seen in the movie Signs. The movie also takes place in Pennsylvania. And secondly, when you walk inside the house, you'll sometimes get this back and forth between Bill and Francis.
You gotta be shitting me. We walked 100 miles, fight 5 million vampires?
They're zombies, Francis.
Whatever. And all they got is this goddamn tape loop? Screw the goddamn army.
And finally, we know that multiple groups of survivors were also looking for Echo Base, and we can safely assume that these survivors never made it to the farmhouse. In the Sacrifice comic, Lieutenant Mora is seen talking to one of his men, and he then says the following: "We have not heard from command in 6 days. That is a fact. We have not heard from any survivors in 10. The military not hearing from any survivors in 10 days implies that the crew from Left 4 Dead 1 were the first and only group of survivors to make it to the farmhouse alive." Before we move on, here's a fun fact. The soldier over the radio is voiced by David Scully, who also voices Sergeant Johnson from the Halo series. He's also the voice of the carrot from Pajama Sam, which blew my fucking mind, but anyway, let's talk about the finale from a gameplay perspective. This is a solid finale. You can either hold out in the farmhouse or the barn, and both are reliable strategies. Find a room, pick a corner, and start blasting. At least that's what I do. When compared to the other defend your position segments from the first game, this is definitely one of the better ones. After fighting off the infected hordes, the military shows up and rescues the survivors. Before we end the video, there is one more thing I want to point out. When the APC drives up to the farmhouse, you can see this written on the side. I tried looking for some obscure reference, but I couldn't find anything noteworthy. During the early stages of Left 4 Dead's development, however, the writing on the side of this APC was different. If you check the wiki, the writing on the side of this APC was instead TK-421. This is a reference to the classic movie Star Wars. TK-421 was the designation of a stormtrooper aboard the Death Star, and his armor was later used by Luke to conceal his identity. And with that, we can finally conclude the video. This campaign is very good. I personally think the chapters could have been a little longer, but even with that complaint, I still think Blood Harvest is a great campaign. Now that all the campaigns are officially completed, I wanted to say thanks to all of you. I never expected this series to pop off the way that it did, and having a platform to voice my thoughts and opinions on the game that I grew up playing is an actual dream come true, and I have you guys to thank for that. This series may be over, but that doesn't mean I'm done talking about Left 4 Dead. I have a few ideas for Left 4 Dead videos in the future that I'm sure you guys will enjoy. Moving forward, I hope you guys enjoy the content. Once again, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.